Today's really, I suppose, about 12 months, really 2 years ago, through the collaborative research network process where James Cook University and Charles Darwin, one of the products of that was a book I put out around about 2 years ago called Beyond the North-South Culture Wars, which was really trying to get a much more personalised narrative about the business of northern development, the successes and failures of the past to a certain extent. I think it's important not just to focus on the business of failure, but to focus on what has worked and what hasn't worked, and to try to relate that a little bit to the new Northern Australian agenda. So 12 months ago we had the release of the white paper, and we've probably now had about 12 months of implementation of that. So I'm only going to sort of revisit what I was trying to say, I suppose, some of the key messages out of the original book, and relate that back to, well, how are things travelling with the white paper and how to go forward for there. I just noticed very fortuitously, I put something extra in there last night and I lost the reef. So that's why I'm calling it Beyond the North-South Culture Wars, because it's a bit of a reflection, if you like, of how things have been travelling in the last 2 years. But to get to that point, I suppose I do need to go back over the book. And in that, I suppose it was a book of stories, really, from my personal experience in a wide range of fields across northern development over many years. But I suppose I was suggesting that North Australian landscape is heavily contested. It is heavily contested in a number of spaces. It's heavily contested in, firstly, the development space, the business of, grand, the conservation space, in the sense of the broad, wild, European notion of wilderness, and the potential to sort of see it heavily protected as one of the last great underdeveloped or undeveloped sort of landscapes. And it's heavily contested, obviously, in the context of Indigenous development and Indigenous policy. So we have quite a contested landscape. I'm really making the point, I suppose, in the book that very strong south to north dynamic driving those agendas. And that's just for the reality that politics, the finance, the population, the money, the policy tends to drive in a south-north agenda. And it's the nature and the quality of that relationship between south and north that we really need to get right if Northern Australia has a future ahead of us. So I'm really suggesting in the book that we hear about what are the mechanisms that would allow some sense of reconciliation between those things. Northern Australia really, in a lot of ways, can't survive without the South. But at the same time, the South can't particularly survive without Northern Australia as well. It's those two futures are fundamentally tied up together. So unless we start thinking about what are the mechanisms that allow us to start to reconcile those significant landscape conflicts that, in my view, have been at the heart of Northern Australian history, certainly since the post-war era. Obviously coming out of colonial conflict, this has been the last 50 or 40 or 50 years of landscape scale conflict that we've all been living through. But what I want to do at the end of this is explore the implementation of the Northern Development Australia White Paper. So I want to relate the key elements of the White Paper to what I'm saying and what's actually happened in the last number of years since that. So I suppose in the book I was pretty much saying some form of reconciliation between these agendas, without some sort of sense of a forward agenda where we end up. And I'll talk a little bit about scenarios later, but at the moment I suppose I want to sort of say without some sort of sense of reconciliation between these conflicting agendas, we either end up with, if you like, a very sort of economic colonialist sort of agenda in terms of core economic development. So we focus on effectively developing the resource but destroying the actual economic foundations that we've got. We don't leave behind, if you like, without resolving these issues of full development focus. We pretty much take out the economic asset without leaving the value add, leaving the economic and regional development foundations behind. At the same time, if we end up with an extensive conservation landscape very much based on regulated protection, without fundamentally understanding traditional owner rights, pastoralist rights and other land rights right throughout the estate, do we end up effectively with a form of regulatory creep without any sense of social justice? Now, where does that leave us? And if we are focused, as the last 20 years, 25 years of implementation of the Land Act, if you like, the last 30 or 40 years of implementation of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in relation focus on land redistribution, land resolution, without the focus on supporting traditional owner-led and Indigenous-led development associated with that land reform, where does that sort of look effectively in a fairly impoverished Northern Australian landscape? So I suppose that's what I was really trying to get at. If we don't seek to resolve these conflicts, these three tensions will play out fairly significantly to the detriment of all Northern Australians. So I just wanted to, why I chose to try to write this more as a narrative rather than as an academic treatise was, I can make best academic analysis of all this and it probably wouldn't make much impact. You know, I think it's much better to be trying to tell stories around these agendas to tease out why it is that these things actually are significant and why have I got something to say about that. I suppose it was important for me to get on the table what is it that I've got to contribute. And I suppose in part it's because I have a history that's bound both in Northern and Southern Australia. So I've grown up in Northern Australia. My family history is from the south. And there's three components of that quite nicely match these conflicts that I'm talking about. So at one level, you know, as somebody who ended up in the convict system, you know, from a family in the convict system in Tasmania, a split in the family, pretty quick, rapid decline of resources in northern Tasmania, which led to migration by first generation up to northern Queensland, the side of my family. But then when you really look at the depth of the history of that part of the family, it was from rural England to rural Ireland to rural Tasmania to northern Australia. And so you get that sense effectively of where to next when that resource base is actually knocked through. So I'm part of the family that's in the pastoral estate in the Northern Australian landscape. I've got a sense of how people view land in the context of the pastoral estate, that sort of really strong sense of history and background, sort of sense of stewardship that people have in relation to land. But it's one that is fundamentally embedded in the Northern Australian landscape. At the same time, my own family ended up effectively born in jail and become part of the urban poor, you know, in both Hobart and Sydney. And my father escaped that through World War II. So he was on his way to New Guinea, landed in Cairns. That was it. That's where I'm going to be back. So I know from my own father, it was very much that sense of the wild nature of Northern Australia, the wilderness values, if you like, the environmental values that drew him back to live and, you know, and for me to actually grow up in this part of the landscape. So I understand, if you like, some of that southern drive on the preservationist side of things, you know, as opposed to the very strong resource exploitationist drive that also comes from Southern Australia that sort of says we've got this vast wilderness up there that we can exploit. They're different drivers, but you can sort of see how that drives out of the Southern Australian landscape. And the final, I suppose, while I've got West Indian sort of heritage, effectively, my mother ended up in one of the George Ardell institutions within New South Wales, with many other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that part of New South Wales. And I think the point I really wanted to bring to that is just that it does give me a little bit of perspective of the issue of race and how race plays out in the context of race relations within Australia, but more particularly how people perceive race between Southern Australia and Northern Australia. That sense in Northern Australia where there is certainly all of the racial issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but also a great sense of many non-Aboriginal people knowing a lot of Aboriginal people and having good relationships with them. So, you know, this sort of bizarre context, if you like, of having good relationships with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people they know, perhaps being a little bit suspicious of those they don't. Whereas in the Southern Australian environment, no great interaction or interrelationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and a huge amount of embedded racism based entirely on ignorance, which might play out in two ways, either on a direct how do we stop Indigenous people taking away resources sort of agenda, right through to the other extreme, which might be a very, very naive view of our understanding of Indigenous people within Northern Australia. So I suppose I'll just play that out to give a bit of a sense that I think I've got a reasonable sort of family history that sort of explains some of the things that we're sort of seeing in the North Australian landscape. And in the end, I've got 5 brothers who basically have played a role in virtually every industry, from the pastoral industry to the fishing industry, to the forest industry in Northern Australia, to the mining industry and so forth, and myself playing a role across a number of those sorts of sectors. So I think it's pretty important just to sort of tease out, if you like, some of the historical perspectives play out within that. But this is perhaps the most scary slide in that I want to explain a little bit about how my mind works, and it's not particularly normal. In that I've played a number of roles over the last 30 years in the business of regional development in Northern Australian context. So in some cases as senior bureaucrat, in fact, senior executive in Queensland Government, responsible for natural resources management policy. So I've been in that regulatory policy space within the governmental sense. Somebody who's been fundamentally involved in the running of regional development organisations. So I used to be the CEO of Terrain Natural Resource Management. I'm now chair of Regional Development Australia. So somebody that's at the interface of regional-led regional development and looking back up at what does that mean from a policy point of view. Through to active land manager, both with conservation and farming assets in Northern Queensland as well. So somebody who's physically been on the ground actually trying to manage and do things. And across all of that, at various times, this time in the academic sector, previously in CSRO, periods of research and reflection. So researcher, mainly in the business of governance systems, so not governance of corporate organisations, but how do we actually see effective governance of our society at a broader level? How do we see effective governance of the Northern Australian landscape? How do we see effective governance of regions? And so that's broadly been the business. I won't bore anybody here with the detail. Elspeth would know the fine detail of the academic sort of theory we apply in terms of thinking about systemic evaluation of governance and governance systems. But probably best to sort of say I have a very systemic view of the world of governance. How do we have governance systems that deliver genuine equity within society? How do we have governance systems that are built on foundational evidence and policy and evidential policy? And how do we get that right in terms of the roles of different scales, the roles of government at the national, state level, roles of community, industry, other key sectors right across the board. So how do we get those sort of scales right from the state to the region to local communities? So just to give you a little bit of a sense that my brain's a little bit unusual because it's played in most of those spaces. It's been one of the beauties of being back within the business of the research world to sort of play out again how these things actually work in practice. So the book does go through probably about 7 or 8 sort of key stories, if you like, from background. And I just want to tease through some of these just to give a bit of a sense of why I'm sort of teasing out some of these significant landscape scale conflicts. And so the first one, I suppose, comes from the role I played as the effectively the first regulator of social impact assessment in the Queensland Government. So Queensland Government did this for a little while as well. For little brief periods of history, we're brave enough to establish a thing called the Social Impact Assessment Unit. And its job was to try to, if you like, drive social considerations and decisions about major development and planning proposals. So it actually came on the back of the Fitzgerald inquiry in Queensland, which was basically looking at major development in Fraser Island and conflict associated, and no capability of dealing with the social in impact assessment, the development decision-making processes. Fantastic couple of years. I felt like I was playing cricket in front of an avalanche because all I had to run with was a very vague notion of social in the definition of the State Development Act. And effectively it was a job of bluff. And I'd have to convince the vast majority of particularly very large corporates, sometimes bigger than the Queensland Government, that if they took a reasonable engaged approach and a clear approach to dealing with social impact, identification and managing the social impact with development, it might reduce the risk associated with their development approval process. It's almost how I had the run of the job. But one of the most interesting I found was the Century Mine in northwest Queensland, which has now aged me because it just shut a couple of months ago, around about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that approval process. And the company, it's been through a couple of company hands, but the company at the time was basically the view that Queensland Government and Australia were going to give a golden path sort of towards approval. So don't worry, mate, we'll support this and get it all through type of attitude from both governments. I'm sitting within government trying to say there are some social and engagement issues here that need to be dealt with. and a company culture that basically sort of said, well, I might do this totally differently in Indonesia. In fact, I do it really quite well in some other external environment. But I'm in Australia now, and my two governments have just told me I want a development approval really quickly. So the whole culture was about effectively fast-track facilitation, no sense of how might we get strong long-term regional development outcomes, and certainly no sense of the fact that, goodness, there were some traditional owners in the landscape, and they had some significant native title interest, and they had significant cultural heritage interest, and they had significant economic aspirations, which they saw this mine as being an opportunity to progress. And that those two things were not necessarily incompatible. That there was a level of expectation of respect and engagement. And that's pretty much at the end of the day what the entire conflict was really about. There was a lack of respect in structuring and managing engagement with traditional owners. Traditional owners were quite surprised and upset by that. It was the first large-scale mine of this type within the country of those particular traditional owners. And it started effectively a 5 or 6 year war that brought the company quite close to financial collapse. In fact, the entire project came very, very close on a number of occasions to never actually occurring on the back of what was a pretty senseless conflict, as opposed to an approach which might have been much more upfront and said traditional owners are the key stakeholder in terms of ownership management of this particular country. Traditional owners effectively in poverty largely throughout this region and need to be significant and reasonable beneficiaries from the development benefit. And as a regional community, we should be making sure that a 20 or 25 year investment in management delivers long-term regional benefit as opposed to a short-term resource extraction. So that's really the guts of that conflict. Murrinduyana at the stage was just starting up the Carpentaria Land Council, very media savvy, very media effective, pretty much, while not anti-mine, certainly not supportive of an unrespectful, disrespectful approach to negotiating these sorts of things. And it caused the company a merry hell in terms of the reality of actually trying to work towards a decent sort of set of social responsibility outcomes. So after about 4 or 5 years of trying to sort of encourage and support and build the capacity of this company to actually just deal with some of these issues, eventually on the back of some very well organised and very well run traditional owner resistance to those sorts of issues, a social responsibility deal that I think was probably about 60 to 70% in the right direction was eventually struck. And we have had some significant good outcomes from that mine in terms of the broader social and regional development, but certainly not as good as they could have been. And certainly they didn't need to happen on the back of 5 to 6 years, or in fact actually about 10 years of major and significant conflict. So I tell that story as a little bit of a way of saying, well, how might we do these things differently? The second one, which we're actually been dragged back into just in the last couple of months, is the tree clearing debate in Queensland. So we did need to act in the middle 90s to late 90s on tree clearing in Queensland. We were the last of the Amazonian sort of scale tree clearers in the country. Yes, that was contributing significantly to the carbon emissions in this country, and needed to be dealt with, as well as being a major biodiversity and landscape scale problem. So the business of regulating tree clearing in a sensible and effective way was something that had to be dealt with. And the Queensland government actually took a very balanced approach to this. They actually established regional vegetation management committees right across the landscape. They brought together in those committees very strong structured engagement between the conservation sector, traditional owners, pastoral sector, regional community and economic development key players. They come up with regional vegetation management plans based on the science, very well informed, very cohesive science agenda. And pretty well got those 99% signed off as the foundation for moving forward. But there's a little bit of impatience in the conservation sector about getting outcomes. And on the back and a culture of perhaps running conservation campaigns that are about bring campaign wins as opposed to necessarily negotiated outcomes. On the back of a particular sort of dry season, the politics reignited effectively about the finalisation of those plans, which resulted for a whole lot of electoral purposes rather than for policy purposes, an announcement of a moratorium and effective override of the regional vegetation management planning process. And a result was probably marginally different from the actual regional vegetation management that were negotiated. So it was an act that effectively utterly destroyed trust within the regional communities, even in the regional conservation sector communities who felt like they were part of the ownership of those processes, effectively for a largely political sort of outcome. And we've been battling, trying to get a stabilised regional vegetation management system in Queensland ever since. So there's a very polarised policy relationship between the conservation sector and the pastoral sector within the state. More changes to vegetation, which actually led to some things that were unworkable in relation to northern development issues and other more balanced forms of development, and consequently a shift back when the coalition came to power. So a policy flip-flop back in the other direction, which opened things up too much in the other direction. So Labor has just recently come to power with a commitment to go back to the old position, when in fact there was a reasonably potentially negotiable path to get to a long-term stable outcome in relation to this conflict. And so if you're sort of listening to Queensland politics at the moment, you'll see we're right in the middle of this significant conflict again, which will take us back to a mechanism which meets the needs of neither party, and in the end actually results in quite significant environmental damage because of the major delays in negotiation of a final outcome. So we'll look back at this in history and sort of say, well, what was the environmental benefit? Well, yes, some of the core regulatory environmental benefits were achieved, but on the main, we've got a conflict that is actually leading to continual contestation about the business of tree clearing, and major tree clearing that doesn't actually need to happen because we're simply in a conflict period and not in a resolved, stable policy environment. So we've got to look back and sort of say, well, what were the environmental outcomes of that? And there were some core environmental outcomes which are already being achieved by a negotiated approach, which simply got sort of rolled into a 20-year conflict that's now led to significant environmental outcomes and really significant investment uncertainty within the pastoral sector. And the final story, which is one of several in the book, I suppose, is really just a reflection on some of my early years of experience in dealing with supporting the Wik people of Western Cape York, some 26 different clan groups, some 13 different language groups, within around 150 kilometres of coastline, almost universally common objective from that mob, to get people out of Arakoon, which is the old mission community, where there's an intense cultural disputation, and the ability to get back to country. So effectively the foundation of homeland movements, people having not necessarily a significant mainstream economic future, but certainly having livelihoods that made sense in terms of involvement in the pastoral industry, involvement in conservation activities, hunting, fishing, and social ability to actually get people out of Arakoon and out of the tension. So people might have heard in Arakoon last week there was an evacuation of 20 of the teachers out to Cairns on the continuing significant conflict, which simply has not been addressed either in the community development approach within Arakoon, but it certainly hasn't been helped by the fact that really the support for foundation economic operations of people to get out of the community, the support for that pretty much dried up around about 15 years ago. So we have not addressed these fundamental cultural conflicts within Arakoon, these fundamental community development issues. So I looked at probably about 8 significant federally funded rural development projects in Arakoon over about 6-7 years, and in every case the core aspirations of the WIC just did not match the core aspirations of the funding programs. So it was as blunt as that. A form of parallel talk. So people might be talking in relation to cattle, in relation to fences, horses, saddles, and government may be talking in relation to fences, horses, saddles, but at the end of the day, the aspirations and intent behind those words so fundamentally different that projects were inevitably going to collapse. And the blame at the end of the day, traditional owners within the community. And that's a repeated cycle that had gone on and on and on since mission days. The only difference being that every time the cycle happened, it actually got larger and more money was involved in the cycle of project establishment and collapse. So it's quite distressing from my point of view to see that our fundamental foundations of Indigenous policy remain not focused on Indigenous-led approaches to development. They're pretty much top-down centralist sort of policy agendas, and we will continue to see a cycle of failure again and again and again. I frequently say to people, well, even the language of closing the gap, to me, is pretty much about we want people to be like us in a policy agenda. It is not an Indigenous-led policy agenda, and we will continue to see these sort of cycles of program failure into the future. So I go through those other stories in there, particularly around Cyclone Larry and climate change and issues associated with it, I think are important to get into, but you can probably get a sense of why I'm really driving at this south to north dynamic and why that has to change, why the nature of that relationship has to change, and why we have to be seeing some sort of reconciliation between those two things, because we do need each other. So where to without a forward agenda? I suppose I've been saying that we do potentially, if we get everything wrong, and look, I'm a positive today, but do quite a few things well, we do quite a few things badly. Where are we on the balance between heading towards doing a lot of things badly and not so many things well, and what happens if we end up not doing many things well and we continue to keep going down that path? We end up in the failed state scenario. We see a form of economic colonialism, fragile boom-bust economy. So fast growth during the resources boom, or whatever the case may be, must drop off. Fast agricultural development, fast water extraction, and then we run out of water. So that boom-bust resource extraction sort of economy, very, very fragile. We don't value add, we don't build foundations of those economic developments. Because we're not dealing with the reality of climate change, because we're not planning around how that will play out in a land use sense, how that will play out in our standards for development and insurance, we end up with an insurance red line across Northern Australia that says, okay, well, you haven't really got your act together in terms of trying to mitigate. We're just going to not insure you. And I know my insurance bill after last up double, if not triple. Strata title insurance bills in Cairns went from 2,000 to 3,000 to 20,000 to 30,000. So, this is one of the things we're sort of potentially heading towards. The absolute reality of growing Indigenous, continuing Indigenous and regional disadvantage. So not just Indigenous communities, but regional and remote communities and pastoral communities, potentially into long-term multiple generation disadvantage. And generally the sort of broad issue of low livability. You in Darwin, climate-wise, might be a good example of that, and very high costs. So particularly in our case in Eastern Queensland, energy costs, where I quite frequently talk about a little iceberg of here's the people who struggle on energy prices in Northern Queensland, here's all the people who don't come to Northern Queensland because of energy prices. So it's just starting to make sure that people are aware this is, if we don't get some of these foundation forward agendas right, this is where we might end up. But if the balance is better and we get more of doing things right versus more of the not so well stuff, well, what does it look like? Maybe it does look like a federation of dynamic regional economies, based around the major centres, whether it's Broome or Arnhem Land or Torres Strait or Cairns or whatever the case may be. But multiple and nimble northern regions that actually talk to each other and relate to each other, strongly connected, with strongly connected governance systems, with genuine engagement with both the north beyond us, so up into Southeast Asia and the tropics more widely, versus focusing our attention effectively of our relationship with Southern Australia and the Australian government. But one driven very strongly by a very strong focus on evidence and tropical expertise and real knowledge and capability within the north. So something that increases our capacity to be part of building the evidence required to actually work through these things. And doing that in a way that actually also creates obviously value add in terms of going from that resources-based economy to value-added economy to actually exporting knowledge and knowledge services. So I think we have the capacity to go both ways. I'm still glass half full at the moment, and I would be of the view that we could end up something on the second as opposed to the first. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the white paper now and where that may be at this point in time. So if we're going to move down that path, there are some key things that need to happen. And I'll talk through these before I talk about the white paper, but it does mean, and these are the solutions I talk through in the book a little bit, it does mean investing in some stronger sense of endemic regionalism, so within the far north Queensland, Torres Strait region, within the Kimberley region, whatever the case may be. How do we really build a stronger sense of endemic regionalism? So the capacity of those regions to be looking at their own economic and regional development futures. And I don't just mean through economic development options, I actually mean in all three key sectors. The human services and social development sector, within the natural resources environmental management sector, but also within the economic development sector. So genuine investment in genuinely inclusive planning and strategy, but also seeing the linkages between those endemic regional approaches have been very strong. So we have right across the North variety of regional organisations, but probably in the last 10 years there's been no clear framing of how we would support endemic regionalism to actually happen. So in the natural resources world, up till about 2007, around natural management, and that died immediately with the change of government in 2007. Around the regional development sort of side, there's not a strong support base for a lot of the regional economic development organisations, and certainly not a very inclusive support base, so it tends to be focused on the resource extraction sort of approaches. And in the human services sector, it's probably one of the most under-resourced sectors in terms of taking strategic and regional approaches. And in the back of that, we just do not have a strong sense of bilateralism between the state and the feds, in particular with regional communities and regional local governments, around what is the land use future. Where are we headed? What is our vision of what regional landscape actually looks like? What is the infrastructure base that goes in behind that? So to give you an example, in Cape York, which is where I spend a lot of my time, we go from a complete preservation agenda to a complete development agenda to a complete preservation agenda, where everybody in Cape York has been through this together several times, and pretty much most people would agree, this is where there's some key opportunities for economic development. This is a vastly conservation-based landscape. If we get those two things fundamentally right, we get the bits of development right, we get the support for moving towards a conservation-based economy on the back of where we want to go, but it needs to be regionally driven and regionally run. So we have no bilateralism between the state and the feds about that. We have no bipartisanship between Labor and Liberal. And so it's a constant flip-flop. And as a result, there's no investment in the conservation economy and there's no investment in economic development. So we're sort of stuck and just can't get through that. In the regulatory side, I talk a lot about the business of co-regulation. How might you really build consensus-based approaches to regulatory frameworks like the vegetation management? In the book, I talk quite a bit about the fisheries experience, which is actually quite different because it's a highly co-regulatory agenda, which brings people together in a consensus-based approach, is evidence-based, and it's adaptive, stable between different governments and different colours of governments. Versus the vegetation management example I had before, which is not stable in any sense and certainly not evidence-based and highly political, which gives nobody certainty from an environmental or from an economic point of view. But one of the things I'm very focused on is the possibility of seeing the emergence of Northern Australia as a very strong ecosystem services economy. This will be, in the next 10 to 15, 20 years, one of the most significant growth components of the international economy. Northern Australia, if well managed, is the jewel in the crown of the nation of being able to attract ecosystem services. But it means we've got to have a cohesive national and sort of bilateral and bipartisan sort of policy approach to that. I notice Carmel going, yes, that's right. And fundamental capability and delivery on the grassroots, traditional owner-based, pastoral sector-based, whatever the case may be. I broadly talk about, obviously, the fundamental shift to place-based approaches in delivery of services, that shift to community-driven, community-led sort of community development approach, as opposed to that policy-driven approach that I talked about before. But not just in Indigenous communities, also in the context of councils and local delivery capability. So that core council-based capability. One of my councils, Croydon, has 900 people. So it's got a rates base of about $1.50, and it just does not have the capacity to do much other than keep the doors open. Embedding tropical expertise, so investing in the capability of universities, CSIRO, other institutions, but doing it in a very cohesive way across Northern Australia. And then I talk quite a lot about sort of seeing all of that come to much more cohesive governance reform. So I'm a big supporter of, at the very least, Territory, Queensland, West Australian government actually coming together with the feds under what's now called the Strategic Partnership. It started to happen 6-7 years ago when Simon Crean formed the North Australian Ministerial Forum and brought the regional development ministers together. But what I experienced out of that happening was the ministers actually started liking each other and talking to each other and getting on the phone. And instead of 3 different jurisdictions doing totally separate disjunct policy agendas, actually coming together on what's important to all of us and running that into the COAG agenda. And the value of COAG is that it's where the deals are done for major budgetary influence, and it's where the deals are done for major national policy. So if we don't have a mechanism to directly influence COAG in a cross-Northern Australian agenda, we pretty much are on the margins, and that fundamentally changed it with North Australian Ministerial Forum. The strategic partnership is theoretically in place, and in my view, we have to use that very cohesively to influence COAG and to influence policy and investment. But it won't happen if we leave it to the governments to sort it out. It's got to come from the grassroots up. So the stronger the sectors across Northern Australia, the stronger they're able to come together with the science community on an evidence base on the big policy issues we all face, the more we can drive that up in a cohesive way through cross-portfolio type approach, the more we will as a regional community be able to drive that agenda. Now we can sit and wait for it to happen, and it just won't. Or we can actually get our act together collectively and start to influence into those sort of cycles. So it's a complex one, that one, but having been in the business of multi-party, major cross-regional policy and investment shifts, I've seen hugely successful results come out of that type of approach. It only ever works on the back of regions actually driving that into the policy agenda. It never works on waiting for the government to decide how it's going to go forward. And then when it happens, it's a massive battle to make it implementable and to actually monitor and evaluate results. So it's a never-ending story, unfortunately, but it's one that's really crucial. All right, some big white paper implications, and then I'll wind up and leave some time for questions. Most people are aware of the white paper and its key components. I'm presuming you've all got a bit of a sense of what the North Australia white paper is, and I don't want to sort of revisit. We'll sort of talk about some key components of it. So you may remember the North Australia white paper was announced in June last year. It's fantastic that there is a bilateral, bipartisan vision. It is a largely economic vision, and it's largely a resource extractive economic vision, and it's a fairly large top-down vision. So these are the things that worry me about it. But at least there's a vision which you can start to respond to. And so that's an important sort of step, that there actually is a vision. It has its foundations, I suppose, on supporting and securing large-scale infrastructure investment. It's very infrastructure-driven. It probably towards the later part of being developed, finally recognised traditional owners actually play a significant role in the landscape. Minor conclusions towards the end around supporting prescribed body corporates and exploring innovative solutions in relation to people utilising tenure for their own benefit and so forth. But overall, it's a pretty stock standard, sort of old school sort of approach. But where I'm excited about it is the fact that there are some governance mechanisms that we can, as a regional community, as a North Australia community, actually see a policy change into the future. So we can look at the positives in the sense that it finally creates a framework where we can have these conversations about the future of North Australia. So some key things relative to the lessons, I suppose, out of the book. There's no strong sense of any building of endemic regionalism within the white paper. So the business I'm sort of saying about how would you invest in building strong regional economic development, the regional sort of social development, regional natural resource management type approaches, those things don't come through very strongly in the white paper whatsoever. One of the things I think will be the most significant problem for the white paper is that there is no call for very strong visionary land, water, infrastructure planning. And that will mean there's actually not the major development that's been envisaged occurring. Simply because the developer, in the biggest scheme of things, looks at North Australia and goes, gee, that's a national shit fight. I don't know that I want to invest there because I'll have to resolve a national conflict just to get to the point where I'm prepared to actually invest. So that bilateralism of agreement about where development occur, how it's embedded with support of the regional community, how it is available and ready for use just is not happening. And I actually think that will bring us to a strategic cliff about investment in infrastructure and development in the north. Water in particular, while Queensland has got a National Water Initiative framework for allocation of water, that has pretty quickly undone in last government, and I could give some quite strong details about the implications of that for northern Queensland. But in the Territory, there's not a National Water Initiative, and WA as well, not a National Water Initiative driven approach to water allocation. So that presents grave risks, if you like, for water security into the future. The key enabling role of infrastructure is important. It's recognised within the white paper. There's the North Australia Infrastructure Facility. They're positive things. But the business of actually planning that infrastructure and working towards its implementation with the regional community needs a lot of work. And again, there's some quite good stories I'm happy to go into around what I think is working in some big infrastructure packages, but we need to replicate that across Northern Australia. There's not effective coordination of major project approvals between the Commonwealth and the state. So this is a major problem, because it's one of the things that major investors will effectively look at the North Australian landscape and just say it's just too hard. It's just too. The Commonwealth and the state don't have clear guidelines. There's actually inconsistency between governments. There's no major coordinative mechanisms between the Commonwealth and the state in development approvals. And every day in the RDA role, I see major investors with an interest in Northern Australia to say it's just too hard, and so I'll move on to some other place. So that's another major issue. It's just not quite dealt with. But it is flagged through the Northern Australian Office of major projects, but it's got a long way to go before that's working effectively. There's not a lot of focus on improved investment capacity of local governments. Some recognition of the need to invest in traditional owner interests just starting to emerge right at the end of the white paper. So there's a few lights starting to, but it is a long way before we sort of see a much more structured investment and focus on the capacity of local government and traditional owners. In other areas of government, we have seen some progress on the carbon front, delivering ecosystem service outcomes in Northern Australian communities, both for pastoralists and traditional owners. But the Queensland vegetation debate over the last 6 months suggests we haven't really learnt much about those issues about broad-scale co-regulation. So there's some positive messages in there that have been happening, but there's also some quite significantly not very effective major conflicts continuing. The potential role of the collaborative state that was announced in the Northern Australia White Paper, but after it was announced, there was a complete change of policy about what a CRC is. So after 2 years of Northern Australians building a collaborative research centre proposal based on strategic and long-term productivity-based issues, the definition of the CRC was changed post the announcement, and so now it's gone back to a focus on, effectively you would say, widgets and productivity-based issues, and very strong focus on industry being in the driver's seat, which is great. But of course, innovation really occurs when industry and researchers and communities all come together to try to move things forward. Now that could be improved and could result in a reasonable result, but it certainly hasn't been the smooth run that was envisaged by the original development of the CRC proposal. Office of North Australia has now been established. That's an important mechanism to keep it all together. It's only really just got going, so it's going to take a little while to sort of see how effective that is. But it's one of the key things that might keep the connections across government, but the issue will be how strong will it be able to be to actually pull together cohesive whole of government approaches on some of these things. And where I see also some continuing long-term possibilities around the continuation of the strategic partnership between Premiers, Chief Minister and Prime Minister. But how do we bilateralism that underpins that actually leads to policy and major investment for the future? So I suppose I just have done that just to tease out some of the implications of where I was 2 years ago in talking about these stories, trying to... and I think, the little dispute in Queensland over the last 6 months that everybody's probably been hearing over here in the Territory, let's go back to forming a separate state. A couple of people have been saying we should form a Capricornia, which is draw that line at the Tropic of Capricorn and we all go separately. I always use this as an indicator that things are not working. When this debate goes up, it's a suggestion that there is a general dissatisfaction with the nature of the North-South relationship. So We've just come out of a period in Queensland of very intense dissatisfaction with the relationship between government and Northern Australians. And as I was saying, this is what we don't want to see, because at the end of the day, separation would be rather tragic. It's that the relationship is not working, and that's why we have to fundamentally do things differently. So I'll probably finish up there. For those that are sort of interested in some of the evaluative academic underpinnings of this, there's a couple of key sort of documents that I think are really worthwhile going back to, but the one I'm probably think is I generally use for, how do I analyse these systems in a theoretical sense, is really a lot of the work that Elle and myself and Anne and others have been focused on up here in terms of coming up with a system of governance, analysing governance, the framework I call governance systems analysis, which gives us a broad brush systemic understanding of how these things work. But there's other bits and pieces that are in there that are worthwhile considering. And that's about it. If you're not a member of the Development and Tropics Facebook page, feel free to join. Just go to Development and Tropics, and it'll just keep you actively up to date with some of the debates and discussions that are going on about northern development. But also, just for a further bit of detail of sort of some of my deeper thinking around the governance systems thinking, go to my TED talk from last year, which will give you a bit of a feel for a little bit more of what is inside Allan's brain around that issue of governance systems and systems analysis. And thank you very much, and thanks, Mike, for the opportunity.